Hey there, wicked listeners, and welcome to episode 6 of Wicked Crimes. As always, I'm your host, Jan Ruud. Happy New Year's, listeners. 2026 is already off to a rough start. I don't know about you, but I get so fatigued watching the news these days. It's almost as if the entire world has lost its humanity. So my wish for all of you for 2026 is nothing but love and light in your lives and those around you. Last year I promised you an interview. It's still coming out, but I've been stuck in editing with this interview. There is just so much information in the interview to go through that I really would love to give you context on. But every time I start researching context, I go down an intense rabbit hole. And this interview is 2 hours long. So while I gather research on it and figure out the best way to present it to you, I've placed the interview on the back burner. But it will be released soon, I promise you that. Before we jump into today's case, remember to join me on social media. We have a Facebook group named Wicked Crimes, and we're on Twitter under the handle @CrimesSouth. If you need to get in touch with me, either to suggest a case or provide me with more information on a case already covered, or for any other reason, please feel free to email me on wickedcrimesa@gmail.com. I'll put a link to all of these in the show notes. You might also notice that some of my episodes have gone missing. The reason for this is that I recently learned a bit more about a law that was passed here in South Africa back in 2022 regarding the identities of minor victims and offenders. So I had to remove some episodes just until I can change them, just to make sure I'm compliant with the law. While I'm not going to directly discuss this new law and what it means, our friend Nicole Engelbrecht from True Crime South Africa has an upcoming episode focusing on this law and what it means, especially in the podcast world. So as soon as she releases it, I'll be sure to plug it here so that you can all listen to it and understand how it will impact cases we cover. While we're on the topic of plugging other podcasts, I want you to listen to a trailer to one of my favorite podcasts, Beyond the Rainbow. You'll hear a bit about Beyond the Rainbow in this case when I mention it again, but for now, take it away, CJ.
Hey there, Rainbow Warriors. It's me, CJ. I'm the host of Rainbow Crimes, formerly called Beyond the Rainbow, True Crimes of the LGBTQ. Please join me as I release episodes about LGBTQ+ crimes committed by and against members of the community. I've covered cases from all around the world, such as lesbian corrective rapes in South Africa, the infamous Australian gay beat murders, and honor killings in the Middle East. I've covered many cases in the United States, some well-known such as Matthew Shepard, Brandon Teena, and Larry King. I've told of serial killers such as Herb Baumeister, Patrick Kearney, and Randy Kraft. But the cases I prefer to report on are the lesser-known cases like Alex Van Dalsen, Lisa Lynn Stone, and Ray Hainish. I'm gritty, raw, and uncensored. Not everybody's cup of tea, but surely someone's shot of tequila. Give Rainbow Crimes a listen and decide. By the way, my listeners aren't only LGBTQ, but from all walks of life. And remember, it's not a crime to be gay or to live your truth, unless you're a murderer.
Now, before we jump into today's episode, I want to give you an extra trigger warning. This case covers one of Australia's most brutal child murders. It includes physical, mental, and sexual torture of 2 children. While I will give you a warning before I start describing the assault, so that you can choose whether or not to skip it, I do want to ask you to try and listen to as much of it as you can, because I want you to place yourself in the shoes of one of the victims in order to understand his later actions. This will all make sense once you hear more information. This case also impacts the LGBTQIA+ community and has been continuously used as one of the main arguments in attacking the community. I was initially hesitant to cover it for this reason, but after some research I've decided it is necessary. There is a lot of misinformation which is actively causing harm to the LGBTQIA+ community that I feel needs to be corrected. It also goes without saying that I will not tolerate any hate towards the community due to this case. Now, I think that's all the admin we needed to take care of. So let's jump into episode 6, Paul Aston and Terry Ryan.
Please be advised that this podcast contains content that could be harmful to some listeners. This includes, but is not limited to, strong language and graphic descriptions of violence, sexual activities, assault, and death. This podcast also engages in discussion regarding various religion, spiritual beliefs, and practices, some of which might be harmful or triggering for some listeners. Please reconsider before consuming this content. The information contained within this podcast is mainly gathered from news articles and official court documents where available. Should you have any more information, or if you know of any incorrect information in this content, please feel free to contact the host through the email found in the show notes.
Our case today takes us to Brisbane in Queensland, Australia. The year is 1982, and high schoolers Paul Aston and Terry Ryan were both 13 years old. On May the 4th, instead of going to school, the two boys decided to set out on an adventure. Paul Aston wanted to travel to Melbourne, where his eldest brother lived, and Terry Ryan decided to accompany his friend as far as the city of Gold Coast, approximately 70 kilometers away from their home. Here, Terry planned to turn around and head back home. The boys met up that morning around 8:30 and made their way to the train station. They boarded a train that would take them as far as Beenleigh, just over halfway to the Gold Coast. After their train ride, the boys decided that they needed a change of clothes, so they ended up shoplifting some new clothes and a few packets of cigarettes. I know what you may be thinking, but from the little information I could find on these two boys, they did not seem to be especially naughty. At the very least, we know that neither boy had a criminal record at this time. I couldn't find any mention of rebellious behavior from the boys before this moment, or any indication that this was anything other than their first act of teenage rebellion. Being close to their first destination, the boys decided to hitchhike the rest of the way to Gold Coast. As the boys were walking next to the road looking for someone to give them a lift, they noticed a yellow four-wheel drive car next to the road. With the car were two men who appeared to have just managed to repair the car engine. Seeing their opportunity, the boys asked the men if they would be willing to give them a lift. The men quickly agreed. Before we go any further, I should probably tell you more about the men in the car. The first person in the car was then 37-year-old Robin Reed. Reed was born in Hampshire, England. He had moved to Queensland in 1961 at the age of 13. By 14, Reed had left school and worked in sales and labour. By the age of 24, Reed had joined the Australian Army, where he was soon stationed at the Inagora Army Camp outside of Brisbane. Reed would be given the nickname head job Bob on the army base. I'll leave a reason for this nickname to your imagination to fill in, but yes, it's exactly what you think. By 1982, Reed had made the rank of corporal and was in charge of assigning new privates at the base to their rooms. This is where Reed had met the other occupant of the car, then 17-year-old Paul Luckman. Okay, this is where the case gets a bit complicated. Luckman, while being assigned male at birth, was in fact a woman. She would undergo gender-affirming care and have her gender and name legally changed years later. She would become Nicole Louise Pierce. For reasons that will soon become clear, I have a very deep dislike of Nicole. But I respect the trans community. I cannot disrespect one trans person while calling myself an ally to the trans community. So, I will refer to Nicole by her post-transition name and pronouns. Pierce had had an extremely unstable childhood. She was born on the 1st of November 1969 in Melbourne, where she was raised by her father and stepmother. I've read some reports that state that Pierce's father had also exhibited homosexual and genderqueer tendencies. Basically what that means is that her father was suspected of being gay in the closet and that he allegedly also cross-dressed at times. I say allegedly because a narrative that would quickly take hold in this case is that Pierce's own identity became a focus in the case. So much so that several articles were eventually found to breach the Press Council of Australia's standard of practice in regards to Pierce's gender identity. Basically, these articles became extremely transphobic in the coverage of the case and made connections between the case and Nicole's gender identity that have never been proven and quite frankly are ridiculous. Unfortunately, this also means that any mention of gender diversity should be taken with a grain of salt. The articles also mentioned that Nicole's paternal siblings all showed what they called antisocial behavior. This could mean anything from them being socially awkward to being a part of a queer community in some way. Whatever the case, at the age of 13, Nicole met her mother. Her mother and stepfather were both alcoholics, bringing more chaos to an already tumultuous childhood. This led to Nicole leaving home at the age of 16. After leaving home, she survived through government assistance and by engaging in sex work. By the age of 17, she decided it's time to turn her life around and joined the army. Remember how I told you that Reed was in charge of assigning new recruits their accommodation? Well, you see, Reed had a system. When a new recruit arrived on base, he would assign them to share his room. It would later be claimed that Reed's reason for doing this was to ascertain whether or not the new private was susceptible to becoming involved in the occult. We'll take a closer look at this a bit later on in the episode. When Reed assigned Nicole to share a room with him, the two of them immediately clicked and became inseparable. This was only a few weeks before the day they met the pair of 13-year-old boys asking for a lift. After agreeing to give the young boys a lift, Reed and Pierce instructed Peter Aston to get into the front of the vehicle and Terry Ryan to get into the back. While the boys initially thought this to be weird, they didn't think too much on it and just did as they were told. As soon as the car was in motion, however, everything changed. Pierce quickly produced a shotgun and aimed it directly at Terry's head, while telling Peter that if he moved, Terry would be shot. A little further down the road, Reed pulled the car over and took the opportunity to handcuff Peter's hands to the headrest of his seat. Then, they told the two young boys that they were police officers, and that if the boys did as they were told, nothing would happen to them. Reed then continued driving. As they kept going, Terry started to ask questions from the back seat, trying to make sense of what is happening to them and what these two people have planned for them. Nicole responded to Terry with the butt of a shotgun. The message was clear: keep quiet. After a while, Reed turned into a narrow strip of road leading to Kingscliff Beach, and then, eventually onto an off-road track. As they reached a secluded area consisting of a mixture of sand and trees, Reed and Nicole told the boys that they had been there before with other people, and that all these people survived because they did as they were told. Reed finally parked the car. With the assistance of Nicole, Peter was uncuffed from his seat and pulled out of the car. Once outside, the pair used thumb cuffs to cuff his two big toes together, and even made a few jokes about how he could not get away anymore. They then pulled Terry out of the car as well, and one of them gave him a hard kick in the groin. The kick, coupled with the fact that the person who kicked him wore steel-toed boots, caused Terry to double over in pain, effectively incapacitating him for quite a while. Okay, trigger warning here. The next bit of information I'm about to share with you is extremely brutal, and if it might trigger you, I suggest skipping a few minutes. Before you do, however, I do ask you give it a try to listen to what happens. I think we owe Terry at least the opportunity to understand what happened here, for reasons that will become obvious quite quickly. While Terry was incapacitated, Reed and Pierce turned their attention to Peter. Peter was thrown to the ground, kicked and beaten. At some point, Pierce used the gun in her hand to beat Peter so hard that the butt of the gun split in two. During the assault, Reed and Pierce egged each other on, started making jokes about the assault, and even went as far as congratulating each other when they thought the other landed an especially hard blow. 13-year-old Peter Aston had started screaming out in pain and fear. This only infuriated his assailants, to the point where they stopped the assault, ripped the boy's clothing from his body, and forced nearly half of it into his mouth as a gag. At some point, Peter attempted to escape. He unfortunately was quickly caught, and the attack continued. What followed was about an hour of physical and sexual torture. Peter was burned using a lighter in front of an aerosol can, as well as cigarettes. His ears were pierced using a lever punch, and the removed skin was saved as trophies. His hair and pubic hair were shaved, and Terry was forced to eat some of the pubic hairs. At some point, Terry was forced to sexually assault his friend, while the physical assault on him was ongoing. Peter again attempted to escape, and again he was caught and the attack continued. This time with Peter laying on his side on the ground, Reed in front of him and Pierce behind him. The pair began taking turns to stab Peter. While all this was happening, Terry had been forced to watch. After seeing his friend attempt to escape multiple times without success, and the extent of the attack on him, Terry knew that there was no way he could get away from the pair. In what I can only call a heartbreaking revelation, Terry realized the only way for him to survive this ordeal is if he was allowed to leave. fearing for his life and seeing no other way out, Terry asked if he could join in on the attack. Reed and Pierce allowed him to join the attack and instructed him to hit his friend using a shovel that they had brought with them. Terry attempted to hit as soft as possible without raising any suspicions. As the assault continued, Reed and Pierce enjoyed a casual conversation with each other, often cracking jokes at the expense of the two boys, and acting like they were having the time of their life. Eventually, the attack stopped. Reed and Pierce turned their attention to Terry and ordered him to dig a grave. While the grave was being dug, Peter, who by this time was so badly assaulted that Terry was certain if he survived this, he would have severely irreparable brain damage, had started to make gurgling sounds as blood filled his lungs and throat. In response to this, Pierce picked up a handful of sand and forced it into Peter's mouth. Soon after, he was shoved into the shallow grave, and Terry was ordered to bury his friend. Okay, let's take a break for a moment. I tried to give you as little details of the assault as possible, while ensuring that you still understand what Terry had gone through. When the details of Peter Aston's murder became public, Terry Ryan and his family faced abuse and ridicule from their peers. So much so that people actually spat on Terry's parents after hearing their son actually offered and engaged in the murder of his friend. This is why I asked people to listen, to understand, to put themselves in Terry's shoes. This was a 13-year-old child who watched his best friend be tortured in multiple ways, who was already forced to participate in it under threat of his own life, who wanted to survive, who showed maturity beyond his years in figuring out how not to get murdered. And people not only blamed him for that, they teased, bullied, ridiculed him and his family. I find this unacceptable. And while I know in a perfect world we all say we would protect our friends and family with our own lives, I can understand that he felt that the only way to survive was to aid in the torture of his friend. And I do believe he was correct. Terry knew that he could give his life for his friend, but that would lead to both of them losing their lives. By sacrificing his friend, he saved his own life, and I am certain that Peter Aston was happy to give his life to allow his friend to survive. After Terry was forced to bury his friend alive, Reed and Pierce allowed him to get back into the car relatively unharmed, if you ignore the psychological and sexual abuse that just occurred. They then made their way to the nearby faux park. Here, they disposed of what was left of Peter's clothes and washed the blood off of themselves. The entire time, they continued making jokes about the assault and murder that had just occurred. After their stop at the park, Reed and Pierce started driving back towards Brisbane. On the way there, they found Peter's glasses in their car. The two of them decided to stop, get some food, and dispose of Peter's glasses in a street-side trash can. After getting something to eat, they started driving back towards Brisbane. During the drive, the men noticed that Peter's hat was also still in their car. So, while driving over a bridge, they threw it out of the window. This entire time, including all the stops, poor Terry was still sat in the back seat of a car, frozen with the fear that he will not survive. So, when Pierce and Reed asked Terry where he lived, he found himself unable to lie to them. They dropped Terry off a few minutes away from his family's home. As they led him out of the car, Reed also stepped out. He handed Terry a pocket knife and told him to use it in case someone attempts to mug him on his way home. He then shook Terry's hand, got back in the car, and drove off. Terry ran straight home, where he immediately told his mother his story. Without hesitation, she contacted the police, and soon, Terry was repeating his story once again for a police officer. Initially, the officers were not sure whether or not this was a prank or the real deal. So, they asked Terry to take them to where Peter Aston had been left. While walking the wooded area near the beach, Terry initially struggled to find the correct area. The difference was that when the teenagers were being led there before and after the assault, it was daylight. But by now the sun had set, and Terry struggled to find the correct area. The officers accompanying Terry started to get frustrated with his inability to find the place, and this caused them to start doubting him. When one of the officers decided to probe Terry a bit, the anger with which the boy responded to him had him immediately believe that the boy was telling the truth. Not long after this, Terry started to get worked up as he realized that the area around him was starting to look familiar. Then, Terry and the officers found a mound of sand stained red with blood it had absorbed, and they all knew what they had found. The officers would later say that this was the most shocking scene they had ever worked. As they uncovered Peter Aston's now lifeless body and saw what he had endured, they felt sick to their stomachs. Immediately the officers got a description from Terry about the people that had done this. Terry told the officers that while the two people had initially told them they are police officers, and they had the buzz cut to support this, they spoke about the army quite a lot, and they called each other Bob and Paul. When asked about the car, Terry told officers that it was a yellow four-wheel drive, but that he could not pronounce the name of the car. He could, however, spell it. This is how the officers knew they were looking for a yellow Daihatsu. Unfortunately, this specific model is similar in shape to a Jeep and was a very popular vehicle under fishermen in the area. Nonetheless, the police immediately circulated the description of the assailants and their car to the local media, and by the next morning, every news outlet was telling the story of the slain boy. The officers did not realize it yet, but the race was already on. By morning, an anonymous tip was called in. There were two soldiers stationed at the Inagora Army Base, just outside of Brisbane, who not only matched the description, had the same names, but one of them also drove a yellow Daihatsu four-wheel drive. Without wasting time, the officers made their way to the base. They were first shown to the car, and when they peered in through the window, they noticed several knives and other tools like a crowbar, which roused their suspicions. They were then taken to the room that Reed and Pierce shared. In this room, the officers found over 30 knives, scalpels, and swords. They also found gay pornographic material showing young men in various bondage positions, several books about Satanism, including one entitled The Devil's Bible, several more books on sadomasochism and bondage, an essay handwritten by one of the two occupants, who I believe may have been Reed, in which it describes what officers believe to be a fantasy about leading a young boy down a bush track at knife point, then holding him in a headlock with a knife at his throat while undressing him. And lastly, officers found a photo scrapbook, but instead of photos in it, It contained around 50 samples of hair, each labeled with a name and what area of a person's body the hair was taken from. The officers also found a pair of crutches in the room, which will soon become somewhat important. While searching the men's room, the officers were told that another soldier from the base appeared to be missing, along with his car. This soldier was Robert Ponzetti. By this time, the officers had also started looking for the trail of discarded clothes that Terry had told them about. They discovered some clothing at Faux Park, as well as blood in a wash basin in the park. Unfortunately, the city had already cleaned most of the bins in town, and officers were forced to search through the local dump. But they did, and so they discovered all the clothing the men had discarded, aside from the hat that had been thrown from the bridge. Then, the officers received a phone call from the police station in Tenterfield, around 260 kilometers away. A man by the name of Robert Ponzetti had entered the police station and told officers that he had been kidnapped by the two people who had killed a child the previous day. Thinking quickly, the officers made a plan, now knowing the general direction the pair were traveling in, and the fact that they were sticking to the highways. A roadblock was set up. Later that same day, nearly 400 kilometers away from Brisbane, the pair was successfully caught and arrested in the roadblock. Okay, let's go back a little and look at what Reed and Pierce did after they dropped Terry off. Their first step was to stop at Mount Kufta. Here, they disposed of a shovel that had been used to beat Peter Aston, as well as dig his grave. They also stripped the shotgun to pieces and scattered it around the area. It is probably around here where Pierce had started to realize that she had hurt her foot while kicking Peter Aston in the face. So, the pair returned to the army base where they made their way to the medical center and informed the personnel there that Pierce had dropped a locker on her foot and gotten injured. The medical personnel treated Pierce and gave her crutches. Yes, the same crutches that was found in their room later by officers. I believe that when the pair got back to their room, they may have switched on the radio or television if they had one in their room back then, and heard on the news about Peter Aston's murder. They would immediately have known that Terry Ryan had told the police everything. This led to them quickly making a plan. They knew the description of Reed's vehicle was also shared with officers, so they needed another one. This led the pair to Ponzetti. They woke him in the early hours of the morning and told him that Pierce had been injured and needed to be taken to an off-base medical facility. Ponzetti believed them and took them to his car. Here he noticed them moving some equipment from Reed's car into his, which included a black crossbow. Why Ponzetti did not find this odd, I'm not certain. Nevertheless, he got into the driver's seat while Reed entered the passenger seat and Pierce the back seat. As soon as the trio had left the military base, Pierce held a knife to Ponzetti's throat from the back. Pierce immediately told Ponzetti that they were responsible for the murdered child in the news. When Reed tried to deny it, Pierce pressured him to tell the truth. And he did. He told Ponzetti that they had assaulted Peter Aston as a kink, but that his death was a mistake they had made, and that they did not want to make another mistake. If he did as he was told, he would remain unharmed. So, Ponzetti did as they told him and kept driving. They made several stops on their journey, The last one was to pick up a newspaper. When Pierce and Reed read the story of Peter Aston's murder, they immediately started pointing out details the news outlet had gotten wrong, including that Terry had joined the attack. When they eventually let Ponsetti out of the car, Pierce gave him some money, cigarettes, and matches, while Reed told him not to make the same mistake as Terry, and that if he did end up reporting them to the police, they would kill him as well. Luckily, Ponsetti did not listen to the men. After the men had been arrested, another teenager came forward and told police that he had been abducted by Reed and Pierce, whom he had met in a nightclub just 2 days prior to Peter Aston and Terry Ryan. The pair had taken him to an area close to where Peter Aston had been killed and told him that if he could escape them, they would let him go. Then, Reed, armed with a bow and arrow, started hunting him. When the teenager started having an asthma attack, Reed apparently empathized with him, since Reed also suffered from asthma, and so the hunt was stopped. The pair loaded the teenager back in their car and took him home. While in the back of their vehicle, he managed to unscrew an arrowhead from one of the arrows and kept it with him, hoping that he could use it as a weapon, or, at the very least, stop them from using the arrow against him. Luckily, this was not needed, and the men eventually let him go. When the teenager returned home, he told his friends about what had happened to him, and they convinced him not to go to the police, as the police will not believe him. I think there is another reason why the teenager's friends had told him not to go to the police. You see, while the state of New South Wales implemented anti-discrimination laws in 1982, homosexuality would only be decriminalized in 1984. This basically meant that while you cannot be fired from your job for being gay, you could still be arrested for it. Whether this teenager was a part of a queer community or not, I can understand that his friends did not want him to tell officers that he had been in a secluded area with 2 apparently gay men. As we well know, in a time so blatantly anti-queer, even the victims of gay men often found themselves stigmatized. This also brings me to another thought. During that time, the Australian Army was also extremely homophobic and would often go on witch hunts to find homosexual or even bisexual personnel serving in the army, and then they try to convince them to take an honorable discharge. If they do not, they would soon find themselves receiving a dishonorable discharge from the army. Yet, somehow, Reed, who was known as Head Job Bob on the army base, and allowed to assign the new young men who arrived on base to share a room with him, was never investigated. In fact, when the 34-year-old Reed had the 17-year-old Pierce moved in with him, and then almost immediately became inseparable, nobody batted an eye. Police would later in their investigation be told that Reed was not very well liked on the base, because he would often, when drunk, share his fantasies of taking young boys into the woods to assault them and eventually sacrifice them in a satanic ritual with other officers. Ponsetti, the fellow soldier the pair had kidnapped, had even shared a room with Reed at some point, but he had gotten other accommodations after an argument between the two, supposedly regarding a dirty floor. A story that I'm not entirely certain I believe. And even if I did, there's still something else that nags at me. if Reed regularly had new recruits staying with him, then a large amount of people on base would know exactly what was in his room, including all the weapons, pornographic materials, and satanic reading materials. Why was none of this ever reported? Why was Reed never the subject of a witch hunt or even an official inquiry about the material in his room and the comments on base? I fear that we already have the answer to that. The scrapbook of trophies that officers discovered in the room. I could not find any information regarding whether any of the people whose hairs were in the book were ever identified, nor that anyone other than the teenager ever came forward to admit that Reed had assaulted them or even collected hair from their bodies. As I've mentioned, victims of homosexual assailants are often stigmatized and blamed. I have seen far too many times when a person was assaulted, especially sexually and by a gay man, that the response is often that they are now also gay, or they must have been gay to start off with for this to happen, or that they are now lesser men because they were the victim of a gay man. So I can completely understand that if Reed had other victims, and if many of them were army personnel, that these victims would remain quiet out of fear of being ridiculed or even being pushed out of the army, especially if Reed could convince others that these people were not victims, but willing participants instead. This, of course, is all speculation. If you had a better theory as to why Reed's questionable on-base behavior went unchecked for so long, please feel free to let me know and we can have a discussion about it. Now, back to the case. Reed and Pierce had been caught, and it was now time for officers to interview them. Pierce was interviewed first. She immediately accused the boys of wrongdoing because they had shoplifted clothes and cigarettes. She then claimed to know nothing about the assault or murder, and when that did not work, Pierce immediately began blaming Reed, even going as far as placing all wrongdoing on Reed and claiming that because she is only 17 years old at the time, she's innocent. Police would later be informed that injuries Peter sustained that could be traced back to Pierce based on Terry's account, as well as Pierce's injured foot, were all more severe than the injuries that Reed had inflicted on Peter Aston. Additionally, Peter's cause of death was attributed to the handful of sand that Pierce had forced into his mouth before he was buried. Reed, on the other hand, remained respectful, although a bit cocky during his interview. He initially admitted that he had hit the boys, but also claimed that this was because they had shoplifted, and that he had not hit them hard enough to cause injury. After a while, Reed started telling officers that he had been hearing voices. And then he moved on to start telling officers that all of this was a satanic sacrifice. The investigating officers immediately thought that Reed was getting ready for an insanity defense. The officers would eventually take Reed and Pierce on a tour to retrace their steps before, during, and after the attack on the boys. The local police academy was also used, and the cadets helped to search Mount Kufta, where the shovel and disassembled gun was retrieved. When officers arrived at the shallow grave where Peter Aston had been buried, they noticed that Reed appeared to enjoy his 15 minutes of fame. He was making casual conversation, joking around, and even photographed sitting next to the grave with a massive smile on his face. By November of 1982, the trial would start. Reed and Pierce were being charged with the murder of Peter Aston and the assault on Terry Ryan. By request of the prosecution, the jury was not shown photographs of Peter Aston's wounds, as they believed that this was so horrifying it could cause permanent trauma to the jury members. Instead, the photographs were only shown to the judge, who then explained to the jury what was in the photograph. The judge had a visible reaction to the photographs, and the jury was still reported to have ended up in tears after hearing all the harrowing details. Pierce and Reed, however, showed no emotion of any kind during their trial, and they were eventually found guilty on all accounts. During sentencing, the judge spoke out about Pierce's childhood. In a statement, the judge said that while a childhood like this would often qualify as mitigating circumstances, the severity of the crime and the wounds that Pierce had inflicted on this child far outweighs any of her childhood trauma. To Reed, he said that some people who commit crimes are mad, some are just bad. But it's clear that Reed is both mad and bad. Both men received a life sentence. Unfortunately, the story does not end there. Pierce would begin receiving hormone therapy while in prison, and eventually legally change her name and gender. She was still, however, housed in male prisons, where she was treated as a woman and given extra privacy in the showers. Pierce was apparently a model inmate, although I did read in one article that she had apparently returned to sex work while in prison as a way to stay safe and alive. In 1999, Pierce was released on parole. Because she was released as Nicole Pierce instead of Paul Luckman, many people assumed this meant that she not only completed her transition by receiving gender-affirming surgery while in prison, but that the surgery was paid for by taxpayers. This is not true. Pierce was one of a few transgender inmates who successfully applied for hormone replacement therapy while incarcerated, but she only received her surgery after being released from prison. It is important to remember that while homosexuality was more accepted by the 90s, genderqueer identities were still heavily discriminated against, and Australia did not have laws to protect or even assist transgender inmates. Even today, inmates who are on hormone treatment before incarceration are allowed to continue with their treatments. However, it is extremely difficult to be approved to start hormone replacement therapy after incarceration. Inmates are also allowed to undergo elective surgeries, such as gender-affirming surgery, but any elective surgery is completely at the inmate's own account. Nicole Pierce's gender identity has been long used to vilify the queer community, as if she committed the attack and murder of Peter Aston because she is a trans woman. This, of course, is not true. After all, there are just as many cisgendered heterosexual murderers out there who can be equally as brutal. When Pierce was released from prison, Terry Ryan and his family, as well as Peter Aston's family, spoke out. Terry Ryan, in an interview with Crime Investigation Australia, said that her body may have changed, her name may have changed, but that she is still the same person who had tortured him and his friends. I fully agree with Terry, which is a part of the reason why I've referred to Nicole by her current names and correct pronouns throughout this episode. She did not commit the murder because she is transgender. She just happened to be a transgender person who committed murder. After her release from prison, Nicole Louise Pierce has been forced to move around quite often. Her first residence after being released from prison was 200 meters away from a local school. When her neighbors discovered who she is, they quickly petitioned to have her removed, citing her proximity to children as their main concern. Since then, each time she had moved, her neighbors would discover her identity before long, and she would be forced to move again. I'm unsure where she is right now, but she will be in her mid-50s. As for Reed, well, he managed to have his sentence readjusted from life to 24 years. This caused outrage from the families of his victims, as this meant that he became eligible for parole in 2006. However, Reed has been anything but a model inmate. There has been reports of him displaying predatory behavior while in prison. On at least one occasion, he was found in possession of child sexual abuse material, and has even poured a large pot of boiling water over a cellmate while he was asleep in his bed. Reed has been flagged as being an extremely high risk for reoffending. The investigating officer has on several occasions said that he fears for his own life if Reed is ever released, especially considering Reed had previously sent him love letters from prison. Yes, you heard correctly. Reed sent the officer who arrested him letters, telling the officer that he fell in love with him while they were touring the gravesite, and that he could imagine spending the rest of their lives together. Now that's just creepy. Luckily, as of end of 2025, Reed is still incarcerated, and he is now in his late 70s. He does, however, come up for parole each year. Terry Ryan had a difficult life since surviving this ordeal. He and his family faced severe bullying and victim blaming since the story broke. He also suffered from survivor's guilt and PTSD. He appeared in the Crime Investigation Australia episode that covered this case, and his body language to me appeared withdrawn, as if he is constantly living in fear. I cannot imagine the horrors this man had to endure, but I do want to commend him. He showed strength and courage in ensuring that he not only survives, but that he remembered as much detail as possible so that he could ensure the people who did this to him and his friend are caught. There is something I did note when I watched the episode on the case. Everyone at some point calls Reed and Pierce monsters or evil or mentally ill, or gives some sort of explanation as to what is wrong with them to lead them to committing such heinous acts. You might notice I deliberately did not do that in this episode. The reason for this is that we often label someone as inhuman when they commit especially heinous acts, because we do not want to believe that it is possible for humans to act like this. I think it is past time that we accept that such heinous and cruel behavior is well within the realm of humanity. It is time we stare at the monster and realize that we are looking at a mirror. Otherwise, I don't think we'll be able to correct the problems in society that causes people to act like this. I have seen several reports that both Reed and Pierce have been diagnosed with pedophilia following this case, and I do want to take a moment to talk about this. Now, before you crucify me, just hear me out. I also had the knee-jerk reaction, and quite frankly, I swore the first time that I heard someone called pedophilia a diagnosis. especially since it was in the context of pedophiles wanting to be called minor attracted people and included in the LGBTQIA plus community. But we'll get to that in a moment. What I did realize after thinking about it for a while and listening to people smarter than me is that pedophilia as a mental health diagnosis can actually help to prevent sexual abuse against children. It is widely agreed upon by mental health professionals that once someone has committed a crime against a child, their chances for rehabilitation is practically zero. You see, the idea is that pedophiles would be diagnosed before acting upon their urges. Then, in therapy, they would be given the tools to deal with these urges without ever touching a child. So in essence, a diagnosis is actually a preventative measure. And I personally believe that we should do anything and everything we can to stop pedophiles before they ruin the life of a child by offending. The explanation I gave to you here is overly simplified, and I do encourage you to read up more on the topic. Or, if you prefer a podcast format, listen to episode 27 of True Crime South Africa, where Nicole Engelbrecht covers the murder of 7-year-old Chaldine Heeman and discusses this topic as well. Pedophilia is a mental health disorder, one that can cause harm to the most vulnerable of us. If we have the power to prevent this, I fully believe that we should. I cannot help but wonder whether if Reed and Pierce had received proper mental health assistance, if Peter Aston would still be alive and Terry Ryan free of that trauma. I also mentioned the term minor attracted person and how these MAPs, for short, wanted to be included in the LGBTQIA plus community. When the idea first started making rounds, many people were confused as to why the LGBTQIA plus community refused so adamantly. Well, there are several reasons for this. The first reason is that the queer community is already being accused of grooming children. There is a narrative out there that any queer person is automatically a child abuser. This is plainly not true, and allowing people with pedophilia to become associated with the queer community will cause only further irreparable harm to us. The second reason is that the queer community has an understanding that everyone included in the community are consenting adults. While most of us figure out our gender or sexual identity around the time we go through puberty, and yes, in some cases even before that, we do not believe that children have the mental capacity to know themselves well enough yet. Now, I know at this moment I'll have people asking me, what about trans children? Because yes, they exist. Well, we can listen to children and take their opinions and feelings into account until such time that they have the mental capacity to make their own decisions. I have never heard of a child receiving gender-affirming surgery just because they suffer from gender dysphoria. In fact, the only times I have ever heard of children receiving such surgery is when another pre-existing condition was present, such as being born with both male and female reproductive organs, which by the way is called being intersex. In the past, these surgeries have often occurred not long after birth, a practice that is being strongly opposed by activists worldwide, as people who have received these surgeries as infants have reported a variety of negative side effects as adults, including being assigned the incorrect gender. What is true, however, is that some children who display gender dysphoria from a very young age receive puberty blockers to help delay their puberty until such time when they can make their own informed decisions. This is done because puberty blockers are not permanent. They simply pause the onset of puberty to give the child time to discover their identity with the proper mental health assistance. And children can usually not receive puberty blockers without parental consent. The last reason why the queer community resisted pedophiles is because pedophilia is a mental health diagnosis and not a sexual orientation or gender identity. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, before covering this episode, I was extremely hesitant. As I've said previously, this case is often used to vilify the queer community because the perpetrators are also part of the queer community. So I've decided to use it as a teachable moment. There are horrible people in every part of the human race, but they do not represent humanity as a whole. So, why should they represent specific communities that they are a part of? Before we move on, if you want to hear more cases involving the LGBTQIA+ community as both offenders and victims, I highly suggest you give one of my favorite podcasts, Beyond the Rainbow, a listen. CJ does an amazing job at representing and advocating for the queer community, while being honest about the offenders who are also present in this community. There is also another reason I chose to talk about the LGBTQIA+ community at length in this episode. You may have noticed a striking difference in how the satanic paraphernalia and mention of it was handled in this case versus other cases I cover. Most notably, that anything satanic is only mentioned and then quickly moved on about. While this paraphernalia was discovered in Reed and Pierce's room, and there are accounts of Reed expressing a desire to sacrifice young boys, the mention of Satanism ends there. Instead, the case is overshadowed by the relationship between Reed and Pierce's gender identity. Almost as if being queer is worse than being a Satanist. But that also inadvertently makes a strong statement. Without focusing on Reed and Pierce's religious and spiritual views, the case was still solved extremely quickly. And Reed, at the very least, has received one of his strongest effective sentences. While I cannot speak for the trial since that information is not publicly available, it does not seem like their interest or even practicing of any satanic beliefs were included in the mitigating or aggravating circumstances. Investigators did not see the reading material in their room and decided that Peter Aston was part of a religious sacrifice. Instead, they took it for what it was: a horrific murder committed by two people who should be removed from society, which is honestly something I would like to see more of in investigations like these. I truly believe that investigators tend to lose their objectivity when something like Satanism is introduced to the mix. And while Reed and Pierce are continuously described as truly evil, I am happy that this case at least didn't get sidetracked by preconceptions that the officers may have had regarding Satanism. At the end of every episode, I always try to find a legacy for the victim. Something we can take from their life or their experience to hold in our hearts so that they did not lose their lives in vain. For Peter Aston, I find it extremely difficult to see a legacy. Not because he lost his life in vain, but because his death has showed us the worst possible side of humanity. Perhaps his legacy is that we should face the darkness in us head on, instead of looking for explanations, instead of using the tragedy that he faced as an excuse to vilify entire communities. We should use it to fuel our passion, to prevent these atrocities from happening to others. You'll notice that I also added Terry Ryan to the title of this episode. And that is because I feel that he was as much of a victim here as Peter Aston. Terry Ryan had to make an impossible choice to survive. At the age of 13, when his biggest source of fear and anxiety in life should have been navigating the social maze of teenagers. Terry Ryan and his family was relentlessly bullied because he survived. He faced survivor's guilt like none of us could ever imagine. So, I think we should give him the respect of being a victim and, more importantly, a survivor. As for his legacy, it is to remind us that anyone can become a victim, and that we should not judge victims for surviving. We should judge those who put them into those situations. Wherever Terry Ryan is in his life now, I truly hope beyond hope that he found a measure of peace in his life, but he has rediscovered the light in the world in some way. Peter Aston, may you rest gently, free from the pain and darkness in this world. And that, listeners, brings us to the end of episode 6. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to follow or subscribe where you are listening. I'd also love it if you left me a review and joined me on social media. Until next week, be safe, wicked listeners.